He owned 17 penthouses across 3 continents, yet couldn't remember the last time he woke up wanting to live. Marcus Aldrich stood at the edge of his Manhattan high-rise, overlooking an empire worth $8 billion, and felt absolutely nothing. No pride, no joy, just the hollow echo of his own breathing in a $40 million apartment designed for parties he never threw and guests he never invited. The view below stretched endlessly, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives filled with laughter, connection, struggle, love, all things that had become foreign concepts to a man who could buy anything except a reason to care. His phone buzzed with another congratulatory message about closing the largest tech merger in history. The same day his assistant reminded him it had been 4 years since he'd spoken to anyone who wasn't on his payroll. 4 years of meals eaten alone at a table built for 12. 4 years of achievements celebrated in silence. The irony wasn't lost on him that he employed over 60,000 people worldwide, yet couldn't name a single person who would notice if he disappeared tomorrow. Not really notice. Not the way someone notices when a father doesn't come home or a friend stops calling. That kind of noticing required the kind of relationship Marcus had systematically eliminated from his existence the moment he decided success mattered more than connection. And he'd been spectacularly successful at both. But everything was about to change because at exactly 7:43 that evening, someone knocked on his door, a door that hadn't been knocked on in 3 years, because everyone who needed access had keys or codes or permission granted by people paid to keep the world at a distance. When Marcus opened it, he found an elderly man with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to carry decades of quiet knowing, standing there without appointment, without explanation, without fear. The old man looked at him with something Marcus hadn't seen directed at him in 20 years, recognition not of his wealth or status or power, but of something deeper, something Marcus had buried so far down, he'd forgotten it existed. Before Marcus could speak, before he could summon security or demand answers, the old man said 7 words that would shatter every wall he'd ever built. 7 words that proved someone had been watching his entire carefully constructed life unravel in slow motion. 7 words that would force him to confront the devastating truth about what he'd sacrificed to build his fortune, and who he'd destroyed in the process, including himself. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will change how you see success, loneliness, and the price we pay for choosing the wrong things to chase. Marcus Aldrich wasn't born cold. He was made that way, piece by carefully constructed piece, starting on a February night 32 years ago, when he learned the most devastating lesson of his young life. Vulnerability equals destruction. He was 14 then, sleeping on a donated mattress in a Philadelphia homeless shelter, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights hummed louder than prayers, and the smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the scent of desperation that clung to every surface. His mother had died 6 months earlier from cancer they couldn't afford to treat properly, spending her final weeks choosing between pain medication and keeping the electricity on. A choice no human should ever have to make, but millions do in silence. His father had vanished 2 years before that, leaving nothing but empty beer bottles and a collection of unpaid bills that taught young Marcus his first lesson in abandonment. That night in the shelter, Marcus had made friends with another boy his age, Daniel, who shared his comic books and talked about dreams of becoming an architect who would design homes for people who needed them most. For 3 weeks, Marcus had allowed himself the dangerous luxury of connection, of imagining that maybe friendship could fill the gaping hole his parents had left. Then he woke up one morning to find Daniel gone, adopted by a family from the suburbs who had space for one more child, but not 2. And Marcus understood with crystalline clarity that caring about anyone was simply another way to guarantee pain. He promised himself that morning, staring at Daniel's empty bed, that he would never again give anyone the power to leave him, because he would leave first, always, or better yet, never let anyone close enough to leave at all. School became his obsession not because he loved learning, but because he recognized it as his only escape route from a life where other people held all the power over his survival. He studied with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every A was a brick in the wall he was building between himself and the vulnerability that had destroyed his mother and abandoned him to strangers. By 16, he had 3 part-time jobs and a 4.0 grade average. By 18, he had a full scholarship to MIT and hadn't spoken to a single person about anything that mattered in 4 years. His classmates thought he was ambitious. His teachers thought he was brilliant. None of them saw the terrified boy underneath who had simply learned to weaponize his fear into achievement. At MIT, he discovered he had a gift for recognizing patterns others missed, for seeing opportunities in chaos, for understanding exactly what people wanted before they knew themselves. He launched his first startup at 22, a data analytics platform that revolutionized how companies understood consumer behavior. He sold it at 25 for $47 million, and instead of celebrating, he worked 18-hour days building the next company, then the next, then the next. Each success required sacrifices, and Marcus made them without hesitation, because he'd already sacrificed the most important thing back in that shelter, his capacity to believe that human connection was worth the inevitable pain it would bring. He dated occasionally, relationships that lasted precisely as long as it took for someone to say they loved him, at which point he would ghost them so completely they wondered if they'd imagined the entire thing. He had business partners who respected his brilliance and feared his ruthlessness, never realizing both came from the same source, a bone-deep conviction that isolation was safety and attachment was suicide. By 35, Marcus had built an empire worth billions on a foundation of systematic disconnection. He had automated every aspect of his life that might require genuine human interaction. His meals were delivered. His home was cleaned by services scheduled when he wasn't there. His companies ran through layers of management designed specifically, so he never had to know anyone well enough to care when they left. He told himself he was efficient. He told himself he was focused. He told himself he was successful by any measure that mattered. But late at night in his $40 million apartment, surrounded by furniture chosen by an interior designer he'd met exactly once, Marcus sometimes caught himself calculating a different kind of math. 4,312 days since he'd had a conversation that wasn't transactional. 6,791 days since anyone had touched him with affection rather than professional courtesy. 11,680 days since he'd felt anything resembling hope that life could be more than the endless accumulation of achievements that meant nothing to anyone, including himself. The numbers were precise because Marcus tracked everything, a habit born from years of needing to control what little he could control when the world seemed designed to take everything that mattered. What he couldn't track, couldn't quantify, couldn't force into a spreadsheet, was the growing void where his humanity used to be, the creeping awareness that he'd won every battle except the one that actually mattered. He had conquered poverty, obscurity, powerlessness. He had everything his 14-year-old self had dreamed of except the one thing that boy had actually needed, proof that he was worth staying for. And now, standing at his door, was someone who had somehow bypassed every defense system, every layer of professional distance, every carefully constructed barrier Marcus had spent 3 decades building. Someone who looked at him not with the careful neutrality of employees or the calculating interest of people who wanted something, but with a recognition that made Marcus's chest tighten with an emotion he'd almost forgotten existed. The old man stood there with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and the knowing eyes of someone who had watched Marcus's entire life unfold from some invisible distance, waiting for precisely this moment when Marcus's fortress had finally become indistinguishable from his prison. The old man didn't wait for an invitation. He walked past Marcus with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned the right to occupy any space he chose, his weathered shoes leaving faint prints on marble floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still on the door, every instinct screaming to call security, to assert control, to remove this intrusion immediately. But those 7 words echoed in his mind, creating paralysis where there should have been action. The old man had said, with eyes that held no malice and no fear, I know what you did to Sarah. Sarah, a name Marcus hadn't allowed himself to think in 17 years. A name that belonged to a version of himself he'd systematically erased from existence. A name that represented the last time he'd chosen a person over profit, vulnerability over victory, love over the grinding machinery of ambition. Except he hadn't actually chosen her, had he? He'd stood at a crossroads at 23 years old, 6 months away from closing his first major investment deal, holding Sarah's hand in a cramped Boston apartment that smelled like her lavender shampoo and possibility, and she'd asked him the question that would define the rest of his life. Choose me or choose this, because you can't love someone and love money more, not in the way I need to be loved. Marcus had told her he needed a week to think. He'd taken 3 days to ghost her completely, blocking her number, moving to San Francisco without a forwarding address, vanishing so thoroughly that when she tried to find him months later, she'd hit nothing but walls of assistants and unlisted addresses, and the cold machinery of wealth protecting its architect. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself she'd understand eventually. He told himself that proving his 14-year-old self right, that attachment was weakness, was more important than whatever fleeting emotion romantic love represented. Now this old man stood in his living room, running weathered fingers along the back of a chair that cost $40,000, and Marcus felt the walls he'd built beginning to crack. "Who are you?" Marcus finally managed, his voice colder than he felt. "And why would you come here with her name like some kind of weapon?" The old man turned slowly, and Marcus saw something in his face that made his breath catch. Not anger, not judgment, something worse. Recognition tinged with profound sadness. The look someone gives a wounded animal that's biting the hand trying to help it. "I'm Thomas," the old man said simply. "Thomas Brennan. I was Sarah's neighbor for 15 years, from the time she moved to Portland trying to forget you until 3 months ago when she finally stopped trying." Marcus felt the floor tilt slightly. Portland. Sarah had moved to Portland. He'd never allowed himself to search for her, had implemented actual technological barriers to prevent drunk moments of weakness where he might look her up, might see what became of the woman he'd chosen to sacrifice on the altar of his ambition. Thomas watched him process this information with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. "She talked about you sometimes," Thomas continued, moving to the window overlooking Manhattan, a city pulsing with 8 million lives Marcus had successfully avoided connecting with. Not often, usually late at night when the loneliness got too heavy. She'd wonder what you became, if you were happy, if the thing you chose over her was worth it. Marcus felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest, something hot and sharp that might have been rage or grief, or the toxic combination of both. "You didn't answer my question," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly despite his attempt at control. "Why are you here?" Thomas turned back to face him, and Marcus saw tears in the old man's eyes, which somehow made him more terrifying than if he'd come with threats or demands. "Because Sarah asked me to find you," Thomas said quietly. 3 months ago, in hospice, when the cancer had taken everything except her voice. She made me promise I'd find the boy she loved and tell him something." Marcus felt his knees weaken. Cancer. Hospice. 3 months ago. While he was closing his latest acquisition, Sarah was dying, and some part of him, the part he'd buried under 17 years of systematic disconnection, had felt nothing because he'd killed his capacity to feel anything that might slow his ascent. "She's dead," Marcus said, not a question but a statement of fact that landed in the room like a body. Thomas nodded slowly. "She died the same night you were on the cover of Forbes, actually. I remember because I was sitting with her, reading her the news on my phone because she couldn't hold it anymore, and there you were, richest self-made billionaire under 40. She smiled when she saw your picture, said you looked exactly like she knew you would, successful and completely alone." Marcus wanted to rage. He wanted to throw this man out. He wanted to rewind 17 years and make a different choice, or barricade himself so completely that this moment could never happen. But he was trapped between past and present, between the boy who'd loved Sarah and the man who'd murdered that boy in pursuit of everything that suddenly felt like nothing. "What did she want you to tell me?" Marcus heard himself ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas reached into his worn jacket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with time, covered in Sarah's handwriting that Marcus recognized instantly despite the years. But he didn't hand it over. "Not yet. First," Thomas said, "you need to understand something. I didn't just come here because Sarah asked. I came here because 63 years ago, I made the exact same choice you did. I chose ambition over the woman I loved, built a successful career in corporate law, made partner at 32, had everything I thought mattered." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "She died in a car accident when I was 45, married to someone else, and I spent the next 30 years wondering what my life would have been if I'd chosen differently. When I met Sarah, heard her story, I saw myself. And when she asked me to find you, I knew this wasn't just about delivering a message. It was about saving you from becoming me, a 78-year-old man with money in the bank and no one who'd notice if I didn't wake up tomorrow." Marcus stared at this stranger who somehow held a mirror to his entire existence. "Here's what I need to know," Thomas said, stepping closer. "Are you going to spend the next 30 years like I did, surrounded by achievements that mean nothing to anyone including yourself? Or are you finally ready to understand what Sarah figured out, what I learned too late, what your 14-year-old self running from pain never got the chance to learn?" Marcus felt tears on his face, the first he'd cried since that morning in the shelter staring at Daniel's empty bed. "What's that?" he whispered. Thomas held the envelope between them like a bridge across decades of choices. "That being abandoned doesn't mean you have to abandon yourself," Thomas said softly. "That the walls you built to keep pain out also keep everything else out. That wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in people who know your worst moments and stay anyway. That it's not too late to choose differently, even if Sarah isn't here to benefit from that choice." The envelope hung between them, containing words from a dead woman to the man who'd killed their chance at everything that actually mattered. But before Marcus could reach for it, Thomas pulled it back slightly. First, he said, "I need to know if you're ready, because what's in here will either destroy you or remake you. And I've seen too many men choose destruction to hand this over without being sure. Here's what I'm wondering. If someone from your past showed up with a truth you've been running from for years, would you have the courage to face it? Or would you close the door? Drop your answer in the comments, Emma Desi +6. Marcus reached for the envelope with trembling hands, but Thomas didn't release it immediately, his weathered fingers holding tight to what might be the last bridge between Marcus and his humanity. "I'm ready," Marcus whispered, though every fiber of his being screamed that he wasn't, that reading Sarah's final words would shatter whatever fragile shell remained of the person he'd constructed to survive in a world that rewarded isolation and punished vulnerability. Thomas studied his face with the intensity of someone who had made a career of reading human nature, then slowly released the envelope and sat down on the $40,000 chair without asking permission, a gesture that somehow made Marcus feel like a guest in his own home. Marcus opened the envelope with surgical precision, his hands operating on autopilot, while his mind spiraled through every possible combination of words Sarah might have written in those final weeks when death wasn't a metaphor, but a countdown. The letter inside was written on simple notebook paper, dated 3 months and 4 days ago, and her handwriting was shakier than he remembered, evidence of hands that no longer fully obeyed their owner. The first line hit him like a physical blow. "Dear Marcus, I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty, though I imagine you will anyway because that's what you do with every emotion, weaponize it into motivation for more achievement." Thomas watched him read, patient as stone, as Marcus absorbed words that felt like they were being carved directly into whatever remained of his heart. Sarah wrote about her life after Portland, about teaching elementary school art to children, who reminded her daily that beauty existed even in broken things, about the small apartment she'd loved, because it had a window that caught morning light perfectly, about the garden she'd tended where tomatoes grew, despite her having no idea what she was doing. She wrote about dating other men who were kind and available and present, men who wanted families and futures, and how she'd tried to love them but kept comparing everyone to the ghost of a 23-year-old boy who'd chosen money over her. She wrote about the day she was diagnosed, how her first thought wasn't fear but relief, that at least now there was a deadline, a finish line to the exhausting marathon of pretending she'd ever fully recovered from being abandoned by the only person she'd ever loved completely. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, hot and unfamiliar, his body remembering how to grieve even though his mind had spent 17 years forgetting. But then Sarah's letter shifted, and Marcus wasn't prepared for what came next. She wrote, "I forgive you, Marcus, not because you deserve it but because I deserve peace. And holding on to anger at someone who was too broken to love me properly would only break me further." Thomas leaned forward slightly, watching Marcus's face transform as he processed absolution he hadn't earned and didn't know how to receive. Sarah continued, "The boy I loved was terrified of abandonment, so he abandoned first, and I understand that now in a way I didn't at 23. I was angry for years, heartbroken for longer. But somewhere around year 7, I started seeing you clearly, not as the villain of my story, but as the victim of your own. And that's when I began the real work of letting you go." She wrote about meeting Thomas, about recognizing in his stories of regret a preview of Marcus's future if he didn't find a way to choose differently, about asking Thomas to find him not for closure, but for prevention. "I'm dying, Marcus, but you're still alive. And that means you still have time to make different choices. Not with me. That ship sailed 17 years ago, when you ghosted the best thing that ever happened to either of us. But with whoever comes next. With yourself. With the 14-year-old boy inside you who's been running the show from a place of fear for 3 decades. Marcus looked up at Thomas through tears, his voice breaking. "She forgave me," he said, as if speaking the words would help them make sense. Thomas nodded slowly. "She did, but here's what you're missing. Forgiveness isn't about erasing what you did. It's about refusing to let what you did keep defining both of your stories." Sarah moved on. "Marcus, she built a life, made peace, found purpose. The question isn't whether she forgave you. It's whether you're capable of forgiving yourself enough to stop running." Marcus felt something crack open inside him. A wound he'd been cauterizing for 17 years, suddenly exposed to air that burned and healed simultaneously. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas showed up every morning at 7, not because Marcus asked, but because that's what fathers do, show up even when they're not wanted because they know they're needed. At first, Marcus tried to maintain his walls, conducting their interactions like business meetings with clear start and end times. But Thomas had the infuriating habit of ignoring boundaries with the gentle persistence of water wearing down stone. He'd arrive with coffee, not expensive artisan blends, but cheap diner coffee that tasted like Marcus's childhood. And he'd sit in that expensive chair and tell stories about his own decades of regret, about the woman he'd sacrificed for partnership, about the emptiness of success achieved in isolation. Thomas didn't lecture or judge or try to fix Marcus with platitudes. He simply existed in Marcus's space with a presence that felt like permission to be human again. The first crack came on day 8, when Thomas made scrambled eggs in Marcus's designer kitchen that had never been used for actual cooking, and the smell transported Marcus back to his mother's final good morning, before the cancer took her ability to stand at the stove. Marcus had cried into those eggs, messy and ugly and real, while Thomas sat quietly nearby, not trying to comfort or stop the grief but simply bearing witness to it. The second crack came on day 15, when Thomas revealed he was dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer with maybe 6 months if he was lucky, and Marcus understood with devastating clarity that he was about to be abandoned again by someone who mattered. But Thomas looked at him with those knowing eyes and said, "That's not why I'm here, Marcus. I'm not here to become someone else you lose. I'm here to teach you how to stay before I go, because staying is the only thing that actually matters and the one thing you've never learned." The third crack came on day 21 when Marcus found himself talking about Daniel, about the empty bed in the shelter, about the moment he'd decided caring was too dangerous, and Thomas listened without trying to solve or fix or explain away the pain of a 14-year-old boy whose coping mechanism had become his prison. Thomas died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, not in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped away the hours, but in Marcus's guest room that had become his room, overlooking the city through windows Thomas insisted on keeping open because he said fresh air was one of the few things money couldn't ruin. Marcus was holding his hand when the breathing stopped, and for the first time in his life, he didn't run from the pain of loss, but sat with it, let it move through him like weather, devastating and cleansing simultaneously. The funeral was small, attended by 17 people whose lives Thomas had quietly altered over 6 decades of showing up when he wasn't expected and staying when others left. Marcus learned at the service that Thomas had spent his final years tracking down people like him, successful and isolated, offering them what no amount of wealth could purchase, the persistent presence of someone who saw past their armor to the frightened children underneath. After everyone left, Marcus returned to his apartment that no longer felt like a fortress, but like a museum dedicated to a version of himself he was finally ready to stop being. He found the letters Sarah had written, not just the one Thomas delivered, but dozens more Thomas had kept, dated across 15 years, each one a meditation on forgiveness and moving forward, and the difference between giving up on someone and giving them space to find their own way back to humanity. She'd written them never intending to send them, Thomas explained in his own final letter to Marcus, but as a practice in releasing what she couldn't control and focusing on what she could, her own healing, her own growth, her own choice to build a meaningful life even after being abandoned by someone she loved. Marcus spent 3 days reading every word, absorbing the gift of watching Sarah's journey from heartbreak to wholeness, from victim to survivor, to someone who transcended both labels by simply refusing to let his choices define her story. Then he did something he hadn't done in 17 years. He started making phone calls, first to his old college roommate who'd stopped trying to reach him after the 100th ignored message. Then to his aunt, who'd raised him for 2 years after his mother died, who'd tried to stay connected until Marcus made it clear connection wasn't something he was offering. Then to the business partner he'd pushed out of their first company, not because it made financial sense, but because partnership required trust. And trust required vulnerability Marcus couldn't afford. Each conversation was excruciatingly difficult, opening with apologies that felt inadequate and explanations that sounded like excuses even to his own ears. Some people hung up, others listened with the cautious distance of those who'd been burned before and weren't eager to touch fire again. But 3 people accepted tentative coffee meetings, and Marcus showed up to each one not with solutions or justifications, but with the simple truth: I was wrong, I was broken, I'm trying to be different, and I understand if that's not enough. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, wasn't a movie montage of instant redemption. It was slow and uncomfortable, and frequently felt like trying to learn a language he should have mastered decades ago. But Marcus kept showing up, practicing the only lesson Thomas had really taught him. Presence matters more than perfection, and connection is built through consistent small choices rather than grand gestures. 6 months after Thomas died, Marcus started a foundation not with his name on it, but with Thomas and Sarah's, dedicated to funding mental health resources for young people in homeless shelters, the kind of intervention that might help a 14-year-old boy make different choices about vulnerability and connection. He hired people not because they interviewed well, but because they'd survived something that broke them and chose to help others with their brokenness instead of weaponizing it into isolation. He showed up at the office not to maximize productivity, but to know his employees as humans with stories that mattered. And slowly, painfully, he rebuilt his capacity for caring about outcomes beyond profit margins. A year later, Marcus sold his majority stake in his companies, not to retire into more isolation, but to free himself for the harder work of being present in actual human lives. He became a mentor to formerly incarcerated entrepreneurs, showing up every Tuesday morning the way Thomas had shown up for him, learning that sometimes the best use of his pattern recognition gift wasn't predicting market trends, but recognizing in others the same fear-driven isolation he'd perfected. He was standing at his window one evening, the same spot where he'd stood when Thomas knocked 2 years earlier, when he realized he could name 20 people who'd notice if he disappeared. Not because they needed something from him, but because he'd shown up consistently enough in their lives to matter. It wasn't the empire he'd built. It wasn't the billions in his accounts. It was Tuesday coffee with his formerly incarcerated mentees, Friday dinners with his reconnected college roommate, the text chains with people who shared memes and moments without transactional purpose. It was knowing his aunt's favorite flowers and his employee's daughter's name, and the story behind the scar on his newest mentee's hand. Marcus would never know what his life might have looked like if he'd chosen Sarah at 23, if he'd learned vulnerability before it required Thomas to show up dying to teach him. But he'd learned something more important. It's never too late to choose differently, never too late to let people matter, never too late to understand that wealth is measured in who shows up, not for what you have, but for who you are. He picked up his phone and called his newest mentee, a 26-year-old kid just released from prison, who was terrified of failing at his first legitimate business. They talked for 40 minutes about fear and risk, and the difference between running from pain and running toward purpose. And when Marcus hung up, he felt something he hadn't felt in the first 35 years of his life. Genuinely, completely, wholly rich. What's the one relationship you've let distance or time erode that you wish you could rebuild? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is reach out before it's too late. Share your story in the comments, and if this hit you somewhere deep, leave a like to remind yourself that connection is always worth choosing.